Some situations don't offer repair, only exit. And in situations like mine, an exit always costs something. By the last week of December, the house already smelled like cooking oil and citrus peel. My mother liked to start early. She said it made the new year feel earned, not rushed. I arrived on the 29th with grocery bags cutting into my fingers the same way I always did. I remember thinking as I unlocked the door that the place looked calm in a way it never did on the actual holiday. It felt too calm. It's weird. It felt almost like a stage before the actors walked on. I'm 34. I work as a senior manager at a digital advertising agency. It is not glamorous, but it pays well. Well enough that I stopped checking my bank balance every week years ago. Well enough that when something breaks in the family, I am usually the one who notices first. Elaine was already there when I arrived, scrolling on her phone at the dining table. My older sister always sat there, as if the seat came with the title. She looked up, smiled briefly, then went back to typing. No greeting, no question about the bags. I put them down myself and started unpacking. My mother called from the kitchen, asking if I had found parking easily. She did not come out to see me. I told myself this was normal. We have always been a family that talks around each other more than to each other. I have learned to move quietly through rooms. It keeps things smooth. Mark came in later that evening, jacket still on, keys in hand. He nodded at me, asked if I was staying long, then went straight to his room. My younger brother has perfected the art of being present without being involved. I used to envy it. Over dinner, my mother talked about menus. Elaine talked about who had confirmed attendance. Names were listed: cousins, aunts, friends of friends. I noticed mine was not mentioned, but I did not interrupt. I waited for a pause that never came. At some point, Elaine said, "We're keeping it smaller this year. Just makes sense that way." I nodded. Smaller sounded reasonable. Everything did, when said the right way. The next few days passed like that. Lists on the fridge changed. Grocery receipts piled up on the counter. I transferred money to my mother's account without comment when she mentioned prices going up. She thanked me with a quick squeeze of my arm, already turning away. I told myself this was what contributing looked like. Quiet, necessary, invisible if done right. On December 31st, I woke early and went for a walk. The neighborhood was already busy. People carrying trays, cases of drinks, bags of ice. Everyone seemed to know where they were supposed to be that night. I felt strangely detached, as if I was observing from behind glass. When I got back, Elaine was on the phone in the living room. She lowered her voice when she saw me, then stepped into the hallway. I caught my name once, then silence. When she returned, she smiled again. A practiced smile. I asked who she was talking to. She said it was nothing important. In the afternoon, my mother asked if I could run one last errand. Plates. Disposable ones, the nicer kind. I went without complaint. On the drive, I realized no one had asked what I was doing that evening. Not where I was going, not when I would be back. I came home to find the table half set. There were place cards now. I glanced at them as I walked past. Names written in my mother's careful handwriting. None of the names were mine. I stood there longer than I meant to. Elaine noticed first. "Oh," she said lightly. "We didn't put one out for you. I assumed you had plans." I told her I hadn't mentioned any. She shrugged. Said it had all come together quickly, said space was tight, said it wasn't a big deal. My mother didn't look up. Mark continued staring at his phone. I felt something shift then, small but sharp. Not anger, more like a change in understanding. A feeling that I'd been standing slightly just off where I should be. I said it was fine. I always say that. I went to my room and closed the door. Through the wall, I could hear laughter starting to build. The sound of people arriving early, settling in. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to decide what this meant. I told myself it was just dinner, just one night. I told myself I had overestimated my role. I told myself this was a misunderstanding that would correct itself if I stayed quiet long enough. But as midnight approached and the house filled without me, I realized no one had checked. No one had knocked. No one had asked if I was all right with it. That was the moment I understood something had already been decided, without me in the room. I stayed where I was. I listened to the countdown through the wall. When the cheers came, they sounded distant, like they were happening somewhere else entirely. And I knew that I just couldn't be there anymore. I left the house just after midnight, while the noise was still peaking. No one noticed me go. That part stung more than I expected. I drove aimlessly for a while, the streets half empty, fireworks popping in bursts that felt too loud for how alone I felt inside the car. I told myself I was giving them space. I told myself I would come back in the morning and we would talk like adults. I spent the night at a small hotel a few miles away, nothing fancy. It was clean, quiet, and anonymous. I lay awake longer than I should have, replaying the evening in fragments. Elaine's shrug, the place cards, my mother not looking up at me. Each memory landed with more weight than the last. By the time I finally slept, I had convinced myself that this was still fixable. In the morning, my phone buzzed, a message from my mother. Not an apology, a question. "Where did you go?" I stared at it for a long time before replying. I said I went out, said I needed some air. I did not say why. Did not ask if anyone had noticed. Her response came quickly. "You worried people. Elaine thought you were upset." The phrasing bothered me. Not, "Are you okay?" but "You worried people." As if the problem was the ripple, not the stone. I went back to the house around noon. The decorations were still up, but the energy had shifted. Dishes were stacked in the sink. Half-empty bottles lined the counter. Elaine was already there, cleaning with more force than necessary. She didn't look at me when I walked in. My mother hovered nearby, folding napkins that didn't need folding. Mark passed through the room once, nodded, and disappeared again. Elaine finally broke the silence. "You could have said something," she said, "instead of making it awkward." I asked what she meant by awkward. She sighed like she was tired of explaining something obvious. "People noticed you weren't there. Mom didn't know what to tell them." There it was, that change. My absence had now become my fault. I said I hadn't known I wasn't invited. The word just felt strange in my mouth, heavy. Elaine stopped cleaning then and turned to face me fully. "It wasn't like that," she said. "We just assumed you had other plans. You're always busy." That wasn't true, but I let it pass. I said I would have appreciated being asked. My mother stepped in before Elaine could respond. "We didn't mean anything by it," she said. "You know how stressful these things get." Stress, another neutral, acceptable word, used to conveniently flatten everything underneath it. Elaine's tone sharpened. She said the table could only fit so many. She said compromises had to be made. She said I was being sensitive. Each sentence landed like a small correction, nudging me back into place. I noticed then how easily they spoke in unison, how quickly Mark aligned himself by staying silent. I felt outnumbered even without anyone raising their voice. The conversation circled like that for a while. No resolutions, no acknowledgments. Eventually, Elaine said something that shifted the air. "If this is going to be an issue," she said, "we should probably rethink how we do things moving forward." I asked what she meant exactly. She smiled thinly. "Just that expectations need to be clear. We can't keep guessing what you want." I heard the implication immediately, the warning disguised as reasonableness. Later, when Elaine left the room, my mother pulled me aside. She spoke softly, like she was trying to calm a child. "Elaine's under a lot of pressure," she said. "You know how much she does for this family." I almost laughed out loud. Almost. My mother went on. She said I should try not to rock the boat. She said families survive by letting small things go. She said this didn't have to turn into something bigger than it was. I realized then that the story had already been rewritten. The exclusion was now a misunderstanding. My reaction was now the problem, and my silence was expected to restore balance. That afternoon, Victor stopped by. My uncle had always been peripheral, more a function than a presence. He handled paperwork when needed, asked practical questions, then disappeared again. He greeted me politely, asked how I was, then went to speak with Elaine and my mother in the dining room. I didn't mean to listen, but their voices carried. I heard my name again. Numbers, mentioned briefly, then dismissed. Victor's tone was neutral, but there was a pause afterward that felt heavy. When he left, he nodded at me on his way out. His expression was unreadable. That night, Elaine knocked on my door. She said we should clear the air. She said it would be easier if I just acknowledged that the situation had been misinterpreted. She said everyone would appreciate it. I asked her what would happen if I didn't. She didn't answer right away. Things could get uncomfortable, she said finally. I'm just trying to avoid that. I lay awake again that night, staring at the ceiling. I thought about how quickly the tone had changed, how easily concern had turned into correction, how the word uncomfortable had been used like a boundary, drawn somewhere I wasn't meant to cross. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I did. The email arrived just after breakfast. I recognized the subject line immediately. Household Expenses Review. Victor's name sat in the sender field, impersonal as ever. I stared at it longer than I should have, then closed my laptop without opening it. My hands were already shaking. Elaine noticed. She always did, when something shifted. "What's wrong?" she asked, too quickly. I said nothing. I stood, rinsed my mug, and left the kitchen. I told myself I would deal with it later. That was my pattern. Delay until the edge dulled. It didn't. By mid-morning, my mother called me into the living room. Elaine was already there, seated upright, phone face down on the table between us like evidence. Mark hovered near the doorway, pretending to look for something. Victor had sent the email to everyone. My mother spoke first. She said she was confused. She said she didn't understand why this was necessary. Elaine followed, sharper. She said this felt aggressive. She said airing finances like this made us look divided. I finally opened the email on my phone. Victor had attached a spreadsheet, years of transfers, amounts, dates, notes, some labeled clearly, rent, utilities, repairs, others vague, temporary help, short-term loan, emergency. The totals sat at the bottom, understated and undeniable. Elaine leaned forward. "Why does it look like you've been paying for everything?" The question was not curious. It felt accusatory. I said I hadn't been paying for everything. I said I had been helping. The difference mattered to me. It didn't to them. My mother's face had gone pale. She said Victor must have misunderstood. She said she never kept track like that. She said family doesn't do accounting. Victor replied to the thread while we were still standing there. A single sentence. "This is pulled directly from bank records and invoices." Silence followed. It was heavy, suffocating. Elaine turned on me then, fully. She said I should have said something. She said it wasn't fair to make her look irresponsible. She said this explained why I was always so sensitive about being included. The implication cut deeper than I expected. That my presence had been tolerated, not valued. That money had been my only language here. I felt anger rise, hot and fast. I told her she hadn't included me at New Year's because it was easier not to, because I paid quietly, because no one expected me to complain, like usual. Mark shifted in the doorway. He finally spoke, his voice low. "This is getting out of hand." I laughed. Once. It felt wrong. My mother started crying. She said she never asked for this. She said she didn't realize it had added up. She said I should have told her if it was a problem. There it was, the turn. Responsibility conveniently handed back to me. Elaine seized it immediately. "If you were keeping score," she said, "you should have been honest, not passive-aggressive." I felt something crack then. It wasn't a clean break. It was a fracture that ran through everything I thought I understood about this family. Victor called a few minutes later. I stepped into the hallway to answer. He asked if everyone had seen the numbers. I said yes. He asked if they disputed them. I said no one had yet. He paused. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. They asked me to help formalize things, going forward. I asked what that meant. He said Elaine wanted clearer boundaries, contribution expectations. He said it sounded like they wanted structure now that everything was visible. Structure. After all the years of informality that benefited them. I thanked him and hung up. When I returned to the living room, Elaine was already on her feet. "We need to talk about how this works from now on," she said. "This can't continue like this." I asked what she proposed. She said maybe we all contribute equally. She said maybe decisions should reflect who puts in what. She said maybe it was time to reassess living arrangements. I heard the threat beneath the logic. Compliance or consequences. My mother looked at me, eyes red. She said she didn't want anyone to leave. She said she needed time. She said I should understand how hard this was for everyone. I realized then that no one was asking how it had been for me. Elaine pushed a document across the table, a draft agreement, percentages, responsibilities, clauses about notice, about withdrawal. "Just to avoid misunderstandings," she said. I felt cornered, angry, tired, betrayed in a way that felt procedural, almost elegant. I said I needed time to read it. Elaine's jaw tightened. "This isn't something we can drag out," she said. "We need stability." I refused to sign. The word felt heavier than I expected. The temperature in the room seemed to change instantly. Elaine accused me of sabotaging the family. My mother begged me to reconsider. Mark slipped away entirely. I went back to my room and locked the door. My phone buzzed non-stop. Messages piled up in the background. None apologetic. All urgent. That night I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling. The spreadsheet burned into my mind. I understood now that the quiet arrangement I had relied on was gone. Exposed. Documented. Weaponized. I had refused to make it neat, and in doing so, I had now made it dangerous. I didn't sleep. By morning, the house felt different, quieter, but not calm. The kind of quiet that settles after something irreversible has already happened. Victor came back mid-morning. This time, he didn't knock. He never did when he was there to do work. He asked if we could talk privately. I followed him into the dining room, the same table where the place cards had sat a few nights earlier. The chairs were pushed in now, like nothing important had ever happened there. He didn't open his laptop right away. That was unusual. Instead, he folded his hands and looked at me with something close to discomfort. "There's something more you should know," he said, "and I should have told you earlier." I told him to just say it. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents I recognized and some I didn't. Old emails, bank summaries, notes he'd kept over the years. Not maliciously, he said, just methodically. That was his way, after all. He explained it slowly, without drama. Over the last 4 years, my contributions haven't just been supplemental. They had been structural, and often critical. Rent shortfalls, utilities during layoffs, insurance premiums, emergency repairs that were never reimbursed. Elaine's credit card balance once, quietly folded into temporary help. My mother's medical expenses, framed as loans that were never meant to be repaid. By Victor's accounting, I had covered just over 70% of the household's real operating costs. Not occasionally, consistently. Now, I already knew most of that in pieces. What I didn't know was what had been said about it when I wasn't there. It turns out, Elaine had spoken to Victor months earlier, asked him, hypothetically, what would happen if I pulled back, asked how exposed everyone would be, asked whether there were ways to stabilize expectations. Victor had told her the truth, that without my support, things would need to change. Downsizing, selling, budgeting. That the lifestyle they had grown used to wouldn't magically sustain itself. Elaine had nodded, according to him. She took notes, asked if I had ever formalized my support. I hadn't. That was the central mistake, or maybe the central kindness. It depends on who you'd ask. The New Year's dinner hadn't been a logistical accident. It had been a test. Elaine had decided, quietly, to see what would happen if I wasn't centered, if I noticed, if I objected, if I made things uncomfortable. When I left, when I stayed silent, when I didn't immediately withdraw support, she had taken it as confirmation. Victor said this without embellishment. He didn't excuse it. He didn't dramatize it. He just laid out the sequence. I asked him why he sent the spreadsheet when he did. He hesitated, then said he didn't like how the conversation was being framed. He said once money becomes invisible, people start to believe it was never there. When I left the dining room, I felt hollowed out. Not shocked, clarified. Everything snapped into place. Elaine's calm when she excluded me. My mother's insistence on harmony. The urgency around formalizing things only after exposure. The language about stability that always seemed to mean my compliance. I went to my mother next. She was in her room, sitting on the edge of the bed. I told her what Victor had shown me. I watched her face as I spoke. She didn't deny it. She said she hadn't thought of it that way. She said she assumed I was doing well. She said she thought I wanted to help. She said Elaine handled the details. When I asked if she knew about the dinner being a test, she looked away. That was answer enough. Elaine didn't bother pretending when I confronted her. She said families should adapt. She said people should step into roles. Said it wasn't exploitation if everyone benefited. I asked her if she thought I benefited. Her response, "You got to live there. You got proximity. You got to be a part of something." I realized then how differently we had been measuring cost. The agreement she'd drafted wasn't about fairness. It was all about control. Locking in my contributions now that silence was no longer guaranteed. Turning obligation into policy. I told her I wouldn't sign. Not now, not ever. She said I was forcing her hand. By the end of the day, it was clear what that meant. Plans were already being discussed, without me. Budget scenarios that assumed my absence but blamed my unwillingness. Conversations framed around my instability, my emotions, my unpredictability. Mark avoided me entirely. My mother oscillated between guilt and pleading. Elaine moved forward like a project manager, already reallocating resources. No one asked what I needed, how I was doing. No one apologized. That night, I packed a bag. Not everything, just enough to leave the room I had quietly paid to simply exist in. As I zipped it closed, I realized something I hadn't before. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be corrected with better communication. It was a system that had worked exactly as intended, until it didn't. Some situations don't offer repair, only exit. And in situations like this, an exit always costs something. I left before dawn, when the house was still dark and the streetlights made everything look flatter than it was. My bag was light, but it felt wrong. It was like the weight I'd been carrying for years had never belonged to fabric and zippers in the first place. I didn't wake anyone. I didn't want a scene, and I didn't trust myself not to give them one if they started with the same lines again. Stability, harmony, family. The words had been worn down in my head. Outside, parts of my car were still somehow filmed in a fine layer of ash from the fireworks. I wiped the windshield with my sleeve and sat behind the wheel for a minute, hands resting on the steering wheel, waiting for some internal click. It didn't come. I started the engine anyway. The hotel clerk didn't look up when I checked in. It was a relief. I wanted invisibility on my own terms for once. The first day passed in a haze of logistics. I called my landlord about my lease. I moved my direct deposits and updated my accounts. I canceled the automatic transfers I had set up years ago. My fingers hesitated when I did it, like they were breaking rules that had kept me safe forever. The first message came before noon. Elaine. So you're really doing this? No question mark, no curiosity, just a conclusion, already filed under betrayal. I didn't reply. My mother called next. I let it ring until it stopped. She texted after. Please just come home. We can talk calmly. I stared at the word calmly and felt something sour rise in my throat. Calm had always meant compliance. Calm had always meant me just swallowing whatever made them uncomfortable. Victor sent a shorter message. Let me know if you need documentation for anything. That was the closest thing to comfort I got. It didn't seem to be overly warm, but it was real. On the second day, the consequences began to show up the way they always do. They weren't dramatic collapses, but small failures you can't ignore once the person patching them stops. My mother texted asking if I could cover the electricity bill just this one time. A few hours later, Mark messaged, the first time he had spoken to me directly in days. Elaine says the internet might get cut. Can you at least pay that? I work from home. I pictured him at his desk, annoyed, inconvenienced, as if my absence was a service interruption. I said no. The word was simple, yet it somehow still felt like stepping off a ledge. Elaine called that night. I answered because I wanted to hear it, the clean edge of the truth, without my imagination filling in the gaps. She didn't ask where I was. She didn't ask if I was okay. She went straight to the numbers. Rent is due soon. Mom is spiraling. Mark is useless. I hope you seriously understand what you're doing to us. I listened, jaw clenched. I waited for a pause, for the part where she admitted she had tested me, where she said she'd crossed a line and knew it. It never came. When I told her I wasn't coming back, she exhaled sharply like I had failed her personally. You're punishing everyone because you felt left out of one dinner, she said. That sentence was so clean it almost made me laugh. It was the story she wanted to tell everyone. The conveniently clean story where I was irrational, emotional, petty. The story where my years of quiet support didn't exist unless it could be used against me. I said, it wasn't just the dinner. She went silent for a moment, then her voice turned colder. Fine, she said. Then don't come back. But don't act like you're the victim here. You chose this role. I ended the call without saying goodbye. After that, the messages shifted in tone, less pleading, more accusation. My mother sent a paragraph about how she had raised us, how she had sacrificed, how she didn't deserve this abandonment. Mark sent one line asking if I could at least pay for groceries until he got his paycheck. Elaine sent screenshots of bills, as if all the evidence could shame me back into place. I stopped responding entirely. By the end of the week, Victor forwarded me a copy of an email thread. Elaine had contacted him again, asking about refinancing and whether they could restructure obligations. She used the same language she had used with me: clear expectations, shared responsibility, stability. I wasn't included in that thread. Of course I wasn't. This was how they operated. Decisions made without me, then presented as reasonable outcomes I was just expected to accept. Victor didn't editorialize. He just sent it. I read it in the bland light of my hotel room and felt something settle. It wasn't peace, no, something harder. Acceptance, maybe. The painful understanding that a person can be essential to a system and still treated as optional. 2 weeks after I left, my mother posted photos from New Year's on her Facebook. Late, like she had been waiting to see how the story ended first. In the pictures, everyone looked bright and happy, glasses raised, cheeks flushed. Elaine stood close to my mother, arm around her waist, smiling like she owned the frame. I wasn't mentioned, wasn't tagged in the posts, wasn't missed publicly. I stared at those photos longer than I should have. I tried to find the crack, the tell, something that showed the truth underneath. But the image held. I guess that's just how it works. Some people get away with things because they're good at presenting the version of reality that gets rewarded. The damage showed up in quieter places. My mother stopped calling after her last attempt ended in silence. Mark's messages became sparse, then stopped. Elaine's anger moved on to other targets, as anger usually does when it can't get traction. I found an apartment the next month. It was small and clean. It was mine. I unpacked the bag I had left with and realized how little of my life had been anchored in things. Most of it had been anchored in obligation. The first time I cooked in my own kitchen, I waited for the guilt to arrive, like a reflex. It did, of course. Then it passed, like a wave that didn't drown me. Sometimes, late at night, I would scroll through my bank history and feel a strange grief. Not for losing the money, for what I had been buying without knowing it. Time, permission, a seemingly grudging place at a table that didn't have my name on it. I didn't file anything. I didn't demand repayment. I didn't go to war. I just stopped. That was the action. That was the line I chose. And everything resolved itself the only way it could. Either I stayed and continued paying the price, or I left and paid it all at once. I thought about that often in the weeks after. The fact that there was no clean ending, that there was no version where everyone understood, that there was no apology waiting behind the next door, no sudden reversal that made it feel fair. Only distance, only quiet, only the slow rebuild of a life that didn't require me to disappear inside it. On New Year's Eve the following year, I ate dinner alone at my small table. I didn't post it. I didn't tell anyone. I just ate, listened to fireworks in the distance, and noticed that my hands weren't shaking. I couldn't tell you if it was worth it. I only knew that staying had been costing me in ways I could no longer afford.